Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation. My name is Latika Gupta and I work at the foundation as Director Projects. To briefly introduce SSAF, that some of you may already be familiar with, it was established in 2016 with the mandate to carry forward the legacy of scholar and photographer Umrao Singh Sher-Gil. His daughter, who was a pioneering figure of modern Indian art, Amrita Sher-Gil, and her nephew and niece, artist Vivan Sundaram, and filmmaker and television journalist, late Navina Sundaram. Since its inception, the foundation's mandate has really been to support and enable conjunctions of artistic and cultural practice that in some way deals with historical memory or various sorts of historicities. And this is with a view to perhaps supporting or creating futures based on secular principles and the freedom of expression. We are committed to advancing creative independence and supporting alternative and heterodox practices. I'd encourage those of you who are not familiar with our work to visit our website, ssaf.in, for a glimpse of our programs, which includes an extensive grants program and also our publications program, SSAF Tulika Books. The SSAF Lab, which is hosting this panel this evening, was set up as an incubatory space for discursive, processual, and experimental strategies of practice. Of course, with the pandemic, we have been conducting our work online primarily, but it lends itself to interdisciplinary dialogue through multiple formats, such as workshops, talks, symposiums, screenings, and longer duration practice-based projects such as Subasri's that further the objectives of SSAF. Trails of Partition, Assam and the NRC, with Rohini Mohan, Abhishek Saha, and Makepeace Sitlhou, is the third in a series of discussions curated by filmmaker and curator Subasri Krishnan for the SSAF Lab. Previous panels, Citizenship and its Discontents and Image and Memory, have included academics, lawyers, poets, and filmmakers whose work has critically engaged with borders, the nation state, and the partition of the Indian subcontinent, particularly along the eastern borders. And I'm really happy to see that some of our previous panelists are also a part of the audience today, and we look forward to our interactions with you. The series, as I mentioned, is a part of Subasri's larger multi-format research project, and she'll tell you a little bit about it, which is called Facing History and Ourselves, that foregrounds oral testimonies as a mode of creating alternative histories of people and places, along with, let's say, material traces that enable a historical memory of belonging alongside ethnic, religious, and linguistic categories, really as a way to start building an archive of people and their lives beyond the categories of, let's say, citizen, foreigner, etc., mandated by the nation state. The NRC, or the National Register of Citizenship, perhaps became a part of our everyday consciousness, and by our, I mean all of us in the mainland, so to speak, with the CAA, or the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019. However, the NRC that was enacted in Assam between 2015 and 19 has a much longer history that can be traced to the partition of the subcontinent and the ensuing migrations. Subasri will tell us more about the panel and also introduce our fabulous speakers this evening. And as most of you already know, Subasri is a filmmaker whose work engages with questions of citizenship through the lens of memory, migration, and testimony. An extensive filmography includes Brave New Medium on internet censorship in Southeast Asia, This or That Particular Person about official identity documents, What the Fields Remember about the Nellie Massacre in Assam in 1983, Sikri Vasanai, Dance of the Butterfly, about a disappearing music form in Cherang district in Assam, and a forthcoming film, Shadowlines, explores questions of citizenship and nationhood in contemporary Assam through the NRC exercise. She also leads the media lab at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements and is a part of the team that curates the Urban Lens Film Festival. And before I hand over to Subasri, just a few sort of technical or housekeeping points. We'd like to inform you that this event is being recorded. We'll request the audience to keep your audio and video off throughout the event, please. Put your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screens. You're welcome to add your comments and questions through the panel. And these will be moderated by Makepeace and Subasri and addressed by the panelists as we go along. So over to you, Subasri.
Thank you so much, Latika, for introducing the session and introducing me. Before I just speak a few lines about the project itself and introducing Rohini, Makepeace, and Abhishek, I would like to actually thank SSAF from the bottom of my heart for coming on board as a collaborator on this project. And in particular, I would like to thank Gayatri, Malvika, and Saurav, for those of you who've been attending the panel discussions. All the lovely poster design you've been seeing is Saurav's work. And last but never the least, thank you, Latika, for being such a willing sounding board to the multiple, sometimes crazy ideas I keep coming up with, and also a very deep engagement with the project Facing History and Ourselves. Facing History and Ourselves is an oral history project that attempts to map out lived experiences who see themselves caught in the citizenship quagmire in Assam. And this is various categories of peoples. So whether that's those who've been put in detention centers since the mid-90s and have come out and try to rebuild their lives, or those who find themselves in a somewhat liminal space, the 1.9 million people, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, whose names are not in the NRC, but we don't know what the future holds because they've actually not been able to go to foreigners tribunals and start the cases because of a certain sort of bureaucratic trail that is unending. And of course, the third category of people, for those of you who've been covering Assam and know about Assam, is called what you call the D voter, or the doubtful voter, where basically your name is put on the electoral roll as D, as marked as D. So, I mean, what the project attempts to do is in some ways not just speak of the experience of seen in some ways as a foreigner or somebody whose citizenship status is in question, but what does kind of the everyday life comprise of? I mean, the project kind of attempts to do that. It is an oral history project. And along with that, what the project also attempts to do is to look at somewhat the long arc of citizenship laws itself in the country, the way they've evolved, and in Assam. So that's the project. So there are two parts to the project. So one is a video essay that's hopefully will be coming out in the next month and a half. The second part of the project is actually a series of conversations that all of you have so generously come and been part of and contributed to, is to speak to, as Latika already mentioned, whether they're filmmakers or poets or academics or journalists, which is what this session will be about, who've actually been actively thinking about not just question of citizenship, but this idea of what do we mean by the nation, which we are very much part of all of that. And most of our lives is about that. But people who, through their work, quietly and not so quietly, have actually been chipping at this question of what is this idea of borders and nation through multiple ways. So this is the third and final session of the conversation series, which is Trails of Partition, Assam and the NRC. The first two set of conversations that took place actually last year, you will find it on the SSAF website. So those of you here who would be interested in watching it, it's there. The third and final part of today's session, which is what we're all here as a title suggests, is, I mean, I felt that it was important to finish this conversation series with this, because in many ways, I mean, I'm sure many of you who know about Assam know this, what we're witnessing in Assam is in many ways a continuum of history. And as Professor Sanjeev Barwa has written about this extensively, it is in many ways the unresolved traces of what happened in 1947 when India was divided into India, East and West Pakistan, and eventually the nation of Bangladesh in 1971. So in many ways, the current NRC exercise is rooted in the 1951 NRC exercise that took place in the partition of India. And of course, Abhishek, Makepeace, and Rohini will speak more about the NRC and the people who find themselves in the crossroads of that history. But I would also like to bring our attention to the fact that even before the updation of the NRC exercise that began in 2015, this was agreed upon in the Assam Accord of 1985, where it was agreed between the All Assam Students Union and others who were doing the Assam agitation and the Rajiv Gandhi government, that the NRC exercise that took place in 1951 would be updated. And that in many ways started in 2015. From the mid-60s onwards, for a period of time, people in Assam have actually routinely been put in detention centers because they were suspected to be foreigners. And in fact, I would encourage all of you to read Abhishek Saha's book, No Land's People. There's a chapter that actually where he very evocatively speaks about it. And thank you, Abhishek, because there were things in that was a revelation to me. So I would really encourage all of you to actually read that chapter in particular in the book itself. And I feel finally, the reason it's important to think about in many ways, while this is a contemporary thing happening in our lives, it's a bureaucratic exercise. It's also the coming together of politics and identity and citizenship. I think it's important to think about the long arc of history when it comes to the citizenship questions in Assam. I believe that one hopes that by perhaps understanding the past and acknowledging the cracks and slippages that have been part of this history, it may provide us some clues as to how to think of an inclusive future. So that is the reason behind this panel. And I hope listening to all three of them today, we could collectively think about together through some of these questions. And before I introduce Makepeace, Abhishek and Rohini, thank you so much, three of you, for agreeing to be part of this panel, for generously giving your time. Rohini, if I may say so, has a broken foot. So does Makepeace has also dealing with injury, and Abhishek is on a family holiday. So really, thank you to each and every one of you. And also for the work you've actually been doing in Assam, thinking about it, writing about it, and helping us all actually understand what is actually going on. So let me start. In no particular order, I'll start with Makepeace. Makepeace Sitlhou is an independent journalist covering India's Northeast region. She writes on politics, identity, gender, and governance. Her work has been published in several publications like the CNN, the Daily Beast, Vogue Business, Al Jazeera, and the British Medical Journal. She's been a recipient of the South Asian Journalism Association Award for Business Reporting, Reading Award in the Lifestyle category, Lardli Media Award for Gender-Sensitive Reporting, and a special mention in the Asian College of Journalism Award for Investigative Journalism. Makepeace previously worked for Amnesty International as a researcher and campaigner, and will be a Herbert Humphrey Fulbright Fellow at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism in the Arizona State University this fall. All the very best, Makepeace, for what awaits you in the future. She will be moderating this discussion with Rohini and Abhishek. To introduce Rohini, Rohini is an independent journalist based in Bangalore. She's the author of The Seasons of Trouble, Life Amid the Ruins of Sri Lankan Civil War. And again, this is a book I would really urge you all to read, especially what is happening in the current moment, and to again understand the history of what has happened in that country. So please do buy Rohini's book, go to your local bookstore and buy this book and read it. And is now currently working on a book on the people's movement in India. Her investigation that used RTIs to find patterns of bias in the citizenship process in Assam in 2019 won several awards, and she was awarded the Chameli Devi Jain Award too. And Abhishek, coming to Abhishek Saha is a journalist and writer. Till last year, he covered Northeast India for the Indian Express. Previously, he reported from Kashmir for the Hindustan Times. He's completing a master's program in migration studies at the University of Oxford. Born and raised in Guwahati, Saha graduated as a civil engineer from Birla Institute of Technology, Mesra, before switching to journalism. He studied print journalism at the Asian College of Journalism, Chennai. He's also won the prestigious Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award for his coverage of the Kashmir unrest in 2016. So thank you all and welcome once again. And thank you to all the people who've actually joined in today. It's a Saturday evening and it's really lovely to see many of you here. So now I'll hand it over to you, Makepeace.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much to SSAF, Latika, and Subasri for having me here today. Since I'm the moderator, I'm not allowed to speak too much, but just allow me a few minutes to kind of, just take you through some of my opening remarks, which are mostly just, my thoughts kind of going into reporting on the whole citizenship, kind of a crisis over here in Assam, and also very quickly, of course, what my learnings have been from my years of reporting here. For those of you who may be not so familiar with my work, I've been basically reporting on the citizenship regime here in Assam. I call it a regime for very, very sort of, conscious reasons, because as Subasri also in fact mentioned that way before the NRC started and commenced in 2015, there were already these laws and infrastructure and policy that had been in place, identifying, detecting so-called foreigners and sort of, processing them through, either at least detention centers or delisting them from electoral rolls. In this regime also, what I've been closely tracking and kind of really trying to understand in depth is the politics and the sentiments behind the anti-foreigner movement. Again, to those who are, like the uninitiated, it's an extremely emotive subject here in Assam, and I think also the rest of the Northeast region for certain understandable reasons. But as someone I think who grew up outside and who belongs to an indigenous tribe from Manipur, I think the NRC wasn't necessarily an issue that I kind of instantly connected with, or it did not like sort of resonate with me the way I think a lot of people assumed that it would, that that I will kind of naturally be opposed to foreigners, quote unquote illegal foreigners, coming and sort of taking away the, the resources and the land or whatever else of the natives over here. In fact, for me, because, I have grown up largely in North India, and I've also lived in the South for about 5 years. For me, I was always constantly subjected to the question of, what is my nationality? Because clearly because of my ethnicity and because of my race and looks and everything. So it was always a question like, oh, well, you couldn't be from India. You obviously must, you're from somewhere, either one of the foreign countries, Korea, like Japan, wherever else, China and things like that, right? So that was always something that I kind of, dealt with and was subjected to. So when I was coming home and I made this move in 2018, for me, it was like, okay, I'm finally going to be kind of amongst my people, or at least, people who will not, who will not raise these sort of questions, and for whom like these questions of like Indian nationality is almost kind of irrelevant in some sense, because at least at the time, that's what I thought, that, largely the sentiment here for the longest time had been very, kind of anti-India and sort of, clearly owing to the many secessionist movements and the armed militancy that had been, going on for as many decades. So I didn't really expect to find, this atmosphere of like, sort of citizenship being put to a test, or someone's nationality, like, being interrogated to a point where they have to prove a lot of things. They have to prove, their residence. They have to prove that they're indeed related to their father or their mother, and, extra whatever related to their, the distant relatives as well in the family tree. So all of it was actually very, very puzzling for me in the beginning. And I mean, not just because of this reason, I think this was only the one part of it. I mean, at several levels, it sort of like baffled me in many ways. I mean, clearly, I also would want to, sort of state that towards, I mean, in the beginning, at least, there was less familiarity that I had with, the history of Assam. For us, like a lot of people from the Northeast, and I'm talking about the days in the 80s and the 90s, we would just really use Assam as like a, gateway. So it was either just catching a train or like catching a flight or something like that. So I didn't have as much like a deeper engagement with the history of the region. But obviously that was something that I learned. And I think the first thing that kind of like immediately that was thrown at me as I was like, reporting on this NRC and, all the Foreigners Tribunals and all in place was the whole agitation from the Assam agitation against illegal foreigners from 79 to 85. And it was almost as if like, it was, told to me like, do you know about the history of this agitation? As if it was a necessary puzzle. It was a necessary piece of the puzzle, not just actually as a necessary piece of the puzzle, but also as some sort of a justification for why this NRC needs to be done. Because, some 855 people died in this agitation, and not doing the NRC would essentially be, kind of an insult to that sort of martyrdom. So it was something like that was, I think, really the starting point for me in many ways of learning about, even the history of Assam and everything. But I think I mean, if I were to be completely candid and honest, perhaps the most bewildering thing for me was, and I speak that, and I can say perhaps to some degree of authority, maybe as, as coming from an indigenous tribe in this region, as would many other people from tribal communities would say, that we've always looked at the Assamese as the outsider. So it never really kind of, it never really quite struck why, would they be looking for sort of apparent outsiders amongst themselves? Like, I understood the issue from a point of national security, perhaps, or very tangibly that, okay, there are people, it is a fluid, it is a, it is extremely like a fluid border and everything. So, and they're not properly manned, or they're not properly sort of, fortified or something like that. But I think when the NRC was going on in its peak years, much of the dialogue was around being this ethnic Assamese and everything. And I constantly really just wondered that, who is an ethnic Assamese? Because I could perhaps answer that question, I mean, ethnically or culturally for several other communities of the region. But Assamese was one such identity, which was kind of always like that kind of a mix, In fact, in some sense, it has been such a diverse mixed set of people that, these are their names that we've had, like I'm talking about, again, all these tribes that have had for outsiders have also been employed for Assamese, whether you're talking about Manipuris or talking about, even for that matter, like in Meghalaya and all that, where there was in fact an anti-outsider movement, and Assamese were also did face the brunt of it, were driven away from it, especially post-statehood. They are referred to as plains people, right? The word Dakhar means plains people. So I think it was also fairly like sort of baffling for me on that front, that, exactly what was the kind of, main contestation about, or how were they kind of sort of really, how are they going to even really detect people? Like, how are they going to profile people? It was sort of a big question in my head. Not to mention here also that, I think it's a historical fact that, Assamese, have also, like, even the kingdoms and the dynasties have had much more sort of exposure to the outside world. They've had better exposure to education, advanced agricultural practices, trade, and of course, as I've mentioned before, that they've been mixing with, several ethnicities, whether from the north, from like far west, right, even from, in fact, somewhere in the North Kashmir as well. So it's been a very sort of quite a potpourri of ethnicities, however, that has sort of, amalgamated into like, what is the Assamese identity, However, through this whole NRC and what I see also as a successful BJP takeover, I've also seen this indigenous identity being weaponized and very problematically appropriated by dominant castes among the Assamese. Again, many of whose forefathers are migrants themselves from the Gangetic Plains. I mean, one easy example that really comes to mind here is, someone called Bijay Bania. This is the photographer who stomped on the dead body of Moinul Haq, the farmer who was charged with, who just, kind of came at the police with nothing but a cane when he and his family were being forcefully evicted in Dholpur last year, the very, very violent evictions that I think just went viral all across social media. I mean, he had a surname like Bania, and he called himself Akhati Ahomia, which basically means pure Assamese. To me, I think that also kind of, set off a lot of like train of thoughts in many ways. For one, that purity always tend to denote two things. One is that, there's a certain superiority when you say that you are pure anything, pure, I don't know, Tamil or pure Bengali or pure anything else, pure Manipuri also for that matter. It's like basically being the single malt of, of all the kind of identities or ethnicities or something like that. It also tends to denote something which is far more like sort of, far more devious in some sense, that there are the lesser pure or impure for that matter variety of Assamese that exists out there who are, so to speak, who are not the indigenous ones, and this not indigenous identity, or at least the kind of campaign around this kind of non-indigenous identity has really, what I've seen in the last few years, birthed this worst kind of vitriolic politics, which, has spread like way beyond Assam and into the rest of the region. Right now, as we speak, we're seeing this indigenous status also becoming a Trojan horse for a mass campaign to proving citizenship in a place like Manipur, no less, where tribes that I come from, like I belong to the larger, sort of spectrum of the Kuki tribes, are being collectively seen as, illegal Myanmar nationals. The playbook is pretty much the same as Assam, that these are communities that live along the border. There are, of course, mixing that happens. There's fluid movement that happens. There is, after all, by the way, there is a, free movement regime in place as well, which goes up to at least 16 kilometers. But despite that being in place, there are these questions which are being, which are being kind of literally manufactured that I've really just seen in the last few years. And following Assam completing its NRC exercise in 2019, where the same playbook is, kind of coming into motion in other states as well. For one, I also want to raise this question about the word indigenous. I've thought a lot about it, and I've, also read quite a bit on how the employment of the word indigenous. And from whatever at least I have gathered, that it's been a word that has been used to, reassert, reclaim rights and entitlements long overdue to a community that has been historically persecuted. So that's when you think of either some, communities, indigenous communities, either in, Amazonian forests in Brazil, or we talk about, like, for that matter, closer home, indigenous tribal communities in central India whose lands have been taken away to big coal mining projects by, either even CIL, or for that matter, even like a, private company or something like that. In Assam, I found like quite a switch. Like it was sort of a major 360-degree shift to this word, literally being sort of weaponized by historically powerful communities, at least in this context, historically powerful communities, to persecute, otherwise, if not kill, people who don't, so to speak, fit into, or who are not allowed to fit into the bracket of what is indigenous to this region. Obviously, this isn't to deny the historical facts that exist of migration, settlement, and conflict between native and migrating communities. However, to me, this history actually doesn't just go back to the, the very often cited colonial grow more food camp program that had started off, during the British rule. It's often been said as, it was under the garb of grow more food. It was really a program, it was really a campaign to, grow more Muslims in mostly the lower parts of Assam, or even for that matter, the civil war in Bangladesh. To me, in my at least reporting and, investigation into this, it tends to, like, if you really look at the migration issue or the migration dynamics in Assam, it really dates back much longer to the period even of the Ahom dynasty. Even apart from the fact that the rulers themselves were, outsiders who came and adopted the religion and the language, the rulers themselves had, in fact, adopted several communities, mostly upper castes, who came from everywhere from Rajasthan to Madhya Pradesh, from Rajasthan to Madhya Pradesh, and settled here in, within the Ahom structure, acquired a rank, and that became like essentially their surname subsequently. But, even prior to that, where we've also had indigenous communities in overall Southeast Asian region settling and moving around for either fertile lands and favorable climate for a longest region. So movement and migration has, been constantly happening. So to me, which is why I think the word, the notion of indigenous here is not as straightforward as it may appear, or it has been sort of, sold, if I can say, without a glimpse of a doubt. However, the beauty, of course, still, I believe, of the Assamese identity is that it's very flexible. Unlike, I think, many other tribal identities, which are far more rigid and, very clearly kind of based along lines of ethnicity and birth and things like that. Assamese identity is far more fluid, and it actually doesn't have, it has adopted, it has welcomed and, people of different caste, different color, ethnicity, religion, even for that matter, have become Assamese and have been accepted as Assamese. And that's something I find is also very, very unique. And often it gets a bit drowned out in the milieu of everything that we see around us, all the more vitriolic stuff we see around us. Yet, however, I think in the current scenario, in the current political scenario especially, it is an identity that requires like a very, very honest and close introspection. And in an introspection where the authors or the people who kind of are deciding who is an indigenous or who is an Assamese for that matter, don't end up equating themselves or equating their position, to the kind of rights and entitlements that, the tribes here deserve and are, in fact, that have been due to them for the longest time, particularly the tea tribes, as they call them, or the tribes that have been settled from central India to work in the tea gardens, from the colonial period and right up to now. Finally, I just want to kind of, say that I've seen very well-meaning journalists and writers, often being very shocked and repulsed by this Hindu-Muslim binary that has come in since the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party has sort of, formed governments in several states in the Northeast. What I see them miss often, however, is this binary of the so-called indigenous and outsider fault lines, which has been growing more and more volatile as we speak. It's not to say that ethnic fault lines did not exist here. Of course they did. But, where community relations may have been more fraught over land and resources, has now become a contestation of claim over indigenous. Like, if you're not indigenous, so therefore you have no right. And if you're not indigenous, therefore now it's becoming a direct sort of a punishment or a direct consequence of, like, your citizenship being put to test, or your citizenship being questioned. And I think the greatest irony, perhaps, and I've said this on Twitter quite a few times, is that the greatest irony really is that it's coming from communities, it's coming from places, it's coming from states, which have just, for the longest time, never really accepted the Indian, themselves, or did not really imagine themselves in the larger Indian, diaspora, or the Indian identity, or this nationality, never even accepted the Indian nationalism, the way it had been sort of, laid down or sort of handed out from the Nehruvian era. But it's suddenly like something that I'm seeing, like left, right, center, perhaps, I'm not sure what exactly are the forces behind, but in many ways it does appear that there's been this kind of, ready adoption, or this ready, it's almost like it's a low-hanging strategy of sorts, to kind of, just pick up on this thing of demanding for an NRC, and, and that, sort of just suddenly recognizing the legitimacy of Indian borders, which were otherwise, sort of inconsequential or irrelevant for many of these communities, because again, several tribes and communities are transnational in this region, and that they live on both sides of the border, either it's Bangladesh or even for that matter, Myanmar. And just to conclude, what the Indian state to me, in everything that I've seen in the NRC, everything that I've seen that has happened since the NRC, and with the way that, the citizenship trials have been going, and the demand for the NRC that has been kind of, sort of really growing louder in other places as well. The Indian state really couldn't do much. It didn't achieve the kind of, Indian nationalism that they hoped through the whole counterterrorism operations that they did, and all of the, several projects and development projects that they had designed to win hearts and minds. But they've clearly managed that with exploiting this whole ethnocentric nationalism. In the Northeast, we used to say, like, since there have been so many, insurgent movements and sort of, secessionist movements as well, we used to say that accepting statehood means that, if you take statehood, means that you've accepted to be a part of India. I think now, if you're demanding NRC, it is sort of the ultimate act of acceding to the Indian state, as well as BJP's own brand of Indian nationalism. I think I will, for now, conclude here. And before I have a few questions for both Rohini and Abhishek, but perhaps Abhishek, would you like to begin from your part?
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks Subasri and Makepeace, and Thank you for the introduction, Subasri, and also thanks both of you for, I mean, you have spoken, you have already mentioned so many important points about the citizenship issues in Assam currently. So I'll do a very short presentation on the book, and maybe briefly mention where the book comes from, basically, and later on, I mean, I think we can talk later more about the book during the question answer sessions. So I'll just share my screen, and my internet could be patchy, but let's see. So this is just a moment. So this is the book. This is No Land's People. It was published last year, and the book is essentially it's basically a personal account plus a journalist's account of what has been unfolding in Assam over the last uh, few decades, in fact, in the name of citizenship determination, and how ordinary people, especially those belonging to certain migrant origin communities, have suffered. Lives have been broken, and I mean, it's a havoc, I mean, in the name of citizenship determination. So very briefly, talking about the personal aspect of, because Subasri and I had discussed this, that maybe the personal account would be an interesting thing to mention in this panel. So I, as Subasri was saying in the introduction, I have been a journalist, and I was working as Hindustan Times Kashmir correspondent till mid 2018. And then I switched jobs and moved on as to cover the Northeast for the Indian Express. And I was based in Guwahati, Assam. But it also happens that I was born and raised in Guwahati. I grew up there. So this return to Guwahati, to Assam, after probably 9 or 10 years, after studying here and there and working elsewhere, this job was also a homecoming kind of a thing. And in mid 2018, the NRC was essentially the biggest story unfolding for a daily reporter. I mean, and my editors at the Express were very clear that this is the story that is the most important story. So put in all efforts to cover it. And my chief editor, Rajkamal Jha, in fact, I remember he told me on a phone call on the first day that, I should make charts on my table about what is the Foreigners Act, under which laws the Foreigners Tribunal function, what is the NRC, under what law the NRC operates, because it's all an alphabet soup. It's very complicated, and this is also a characteristic of the Indian state, I guess, and its legal processes, that it defeats you. It defeats you under the pressure of its complicacy, and how opaque it is. That Makepeace and Rohini have both investigated foreigners tribunals in Assam, and I think everyone will argue that it is one of the most opaque institutions a journalist comes across. I mean, it's a very hard nut to crack. So anyway, so when I came and I started covering this, what I was unaware of is that basically a demerit of growing up in an overprotective family and parents, that I didn't know basically that my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, she's alive. She's in her late, she's old. She's in her late 90s now. She is a D voter. She's a doubtful voter. And the rules of the NRC are such that, as Subasri was earlier saying, that there are pre-existing mechanisms of citizenship determination prior to the NRC, which is essentially the border police, investigation by the border police, and the marking of doubtful voters. So, and a doubtful voter and a person who has been a declared foreigner by the Foreigners Tribunal, or who is being investigated by the border police and her case is pending at a Foreigners Tribunal, can't be included in the NRC. So as a result, my grandmother is out of the NRC. She's one of the 1.9 million people out of the NRC now. So the book basically, then I realized that it's a much larger story. I had to find out how my grandmother became a doubtful Indian. My so and also I had to write the story of what I was reporting on a day-to-day basis. And I think I mean I have had this conversation earlier with both Rohini and Makepeace that you know, I have been a reporter with a daily newspaper. So it's like on a everyday basis, a person who writes a long investigative feature or a story which takes a longer time probably you know, the effort comes in a different way. But for me, it was like waking up every day and basically writing almost every day that this case has happened, that this person was put in a detention center for so many years, and then the Guwahati High Court found her to be an Indian. So many years have been lost, and then this person is now walking out, or this person died by suicide because she was so scared that what will happen if I am put into a detention center, or a poor family is you know is basically ruined because their several weeks have been gone only attending NRC hearings and trying to convince the officials that they are Indians and not Bangladeshis. So it was like since mid 2018 to by the time I began writing the book, you know, late 2000. I think by the time I started writing, it was mid 2020. Yeah. So almost 3 years of every day reporting this same thing. So the personal story came together and the journalistic story came together. There was obviously a question which my editor for the book, Swati Chopra, she and I had this discussion of how do I write it? Do I go with my grandmother's story, or do I remain this objective journalist, you know, the objective journalist who doesn't talk about what he or she feels? But then we decided, no, that probably the honest and the best way to tell the story is to go the personal route and to investigate my, because for my, in my reportage for the Indian Express, I never wrote about my grandmother. And I was always the reporter, you know, the reporter who is just reporting and writing about everyone else's plight, but always forcing myself to ignore that the same story also exists at home. So yeah, and that's basically the book. That's basically the book. And I'm people who are interested, when you read the book, you'll get it. It begins with my grandmother's story and segues ahead to basically capture the humanitarian crisis in general that these processes have caused. That's it. And I mean, there are a lot of points. I mean, this is what I was mentioning, that there were pre-existing mechanisms of doubtful voter, border police, and the NRC also, everything feeds into the Foreigners Tribunals. And what is the Foreigners Tribunal? That's again a long discussion. I mean, to speak very briefly, these are quasi-judicial bodies. This is a photo of a Foreigners Tribunal at Barpeta district. And so, you know, FTs are quasi-judicial bodies, and only in Assam in India, such bodies are there. And FTs are now, you know, I mean, routinely criticized by the High Court, by judicial activists, by journalists, by the Amnesty International. I mean, everyone criticizes the functioning of the FTs, but they continue, and they continue to pass judgments, and they continue to declare people foreigners. That's what happens. And just to mention a few brief points about the NRC is that it tried to prove the citizenship of you know, almost 3 crore residents of Assam on the basis of a cutoff date, that if you can prove your residence in Assam prior to that cutoff date, you are an Indian citizen in Assam. Otherwise, you are not. And so it brought in a lineage-based citizenship determination, that you bring in your documents and you show that you or your ancestors were residing in Assam prior to this cutoff date. And why this cutoff date? Again, it's Bangladesh's history. West Pakistan's onslaught had started on this side on 25th March. So the one day before that is the cutoff. And so 33 million people with around 66 million documents. That's a figure the NRC authorities are proud of, that, you know, they show this figure, they cite this figure often. This is it. I mean, one can go on and on talking about it. And just to wrap up, this one thing which I thought that people here might be interested, even as foreigners tribunals in Assam, and I'm sure that Rohini would be speaking more on foreigners tribunals, even as foreigners tribunals in Assam continue to declare people foreigners, the Bangladesh doesn't accept declared foreigners as their own. So there comes the limbo, there comes the stalemate, you know, that people who are declared to be foreigners are not accepted by Bangladesh as their citizens, and hence there aren't for all practical purposes, there is no deportation. And hence the state manufactures statelessness in a way that it manufactures, Assam manufactures statelessness. There are hundreds of people in Assam, thousands of people who are basically living in a status where they are, and now the Supreme Court has also allowed for bail, you know. So after you are detained in a detention center, if you have spent 2 years in a detention center and you have not been deported to Bangladesh, you will basically be let go on bail, on a conditional bail. So essentially, there is a population in Assam which is stateless. In India, on India's papers, they are foreigners, but on Bangladesh papers, Bangladesh is not at all concerned. They have always maintained these are all internal issues, you know, India's internal issues, so they don't bother. And hence, these people live in a state of limbo. And now, the 1.9 million people kept out of the NRC, they are also in another kind of a limbo, that even the process to appeal against their exclusion in the NRC, and that appeal will again happen at the FT, that process has not started. That process is basically stuck stuck in a situation where NRC has become a political issue, that according to the BJP, the NRC that was published in 2019 with 1.9 million exclusions was not a correct NRC, quote unquote. According to them, the exclusions should be more, that they are not happy with the figure of 1.19 lakh people. They are not happy with that. So according to them, the number should be more. And hence they have said that they will be, and they have filed applications to the court also, to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court is not hearing the matter, and no hearings have come in the case in a long time now. Although prior to 2019, when Ranjan Gogoi was head of he was the Chief Justice, then NRC, it was the Supreme Court that monitored the NRC in Assam. It monitored, and it was leading kind of, it was very much involved with the process. But after the publication of the NRC in 2019, there have been no hearings, if I remember correctly, and the process is stuck. And Justice Gogoi has, of course, retired, and the IAS officer who was leading the exercise, a person called Pratik Hajela, he was also shifted out of, although he was posted in Assam, but he was, the Supreme Court ordered his transfer to his home state, Madhya Pradesh, and he left. So, and now NRC is basically stuck. The fate of 19 lakh people is stuck. And even then, there are reports in the media which says, and I wrote a story in 2020, and there have been subsequent stories later on, that the state in various capacities has started asking for NRC as a proof, that if your name is not in the NRC, police won't give you a clearance for filing your, for getting a passport. And there are cases where people who want to go on Hajj have not got their passport, because their names are not in the NRC and they were kept, and that's why the police couldn't give a clearance certificate. So, yeah, I mean, it's basically there is a situation of limbo for many people in Assam. There's citizenship, which is a kind of a right to have other rights, to quote Hannah Arendt, that people are deprived of that. And the due process is like taking a long time and lives are stuck. And I think, yeah, we'll talk more about the book and the situation later on during the question answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Abhishek, for sharing that with us. It'd be great, I think, if we can go into Rohini's presentation about her investigation back in 2019. That's if I'm correct, right? On the Foreigners Tribunals, and of course, otherwise also her reporting during the NRC exercise.
Thank you, Makepeace. It was really fascinating to hear both of you, because for me, it's like an updation. After, I think the last time I heard people really discussing it was in Delhi during the Shaheen Bagh big protests, and there would be conversations, there would be people thinking and thinking really deeply and in detailed ways about how the happenings in one state in Assam would be affected and would kind of echo through the rest of the country. And that is the last time I really heard discussion. So for me, it's like great to get an update. I'm just talking about this story, which I think after I filed RTIs and got this information, Makepeace and some I know about Makepeace writing, but others also surely did try to get more information. But as Abhishek really did say, the Foreigners Tribunals and the whole process through the border police in Assam, through even the high courts, none of them really give any information. So once in a while you get this data, like the data that he presented from the Rajya Sabha or the Lok Sabha, which then we have to scramble to see with no sense of real statistical closure. We have to kind of have this discussion. I will tell you about what my story was, because my attempt at the time, while I met these people in Assam, so many reporters, and especially the reporters doing this everyday story, like Abhishek was saying, I found that if they had so much information and data, but every time I would come back to say Bangalore or wherever outside of Assam, I found that it was hard for most people who are reading these articles, these reports, to believe those reports, because it is the people. It's not because they were not factual. It is not because they were not written really well. I trusted all of them, but the reason was that the very people who are being accused of being foreigners are the people talking about how they're being victimized. So who wants to believe the victim? The victim is already assumed to be a foreigner or an immigrant or an illegal person. So nobody wants to believe that person. So it became really hard for me also as a journalist, coming from a different state, to write about this with a sense, what else can one write? So the idea that I thought I would do was to find maybe official data that the government itself has, whatever data is there, to find in the system itself if there was a proof of bias, if there was a pattern of bias. What is wrong with it? Are they not illegal immigrants, or are they really illegal immigrants who've just been found out and declared foreigners? So I just have, because there is some data, I'll just share it with you. So another reason is my cynicism for people not reading long articles, that I made this presentation, which has basically most of the... So I start here because this is Shah Jahan, who's in the green t-shirt. And this is his family. One of the first I met, he was helping me go through, I don't speak Assamese or Bengali, so he was helping me with translations, he was helping me with meeting people, and he was a also someone who, at the end of the day, told about his own family. And, the other panelists know him very well. He was also a part-time journalist. He was trying many things. He's a wonderful guy. And this is his family. This is his brother. I tried to get the others. They were working, his mother and father. This is a family that had every paper that, that the NRC or the Foreigners Tribunal will ask for, and they showed it. But every time as an example of what would happen while reporting or while talking to anyone in Assam about this foreigners issue, about the citizenship issue, they call it foreigners issue, really, not the citizenship issue as the rest of the country does. They would first say, okay, wait a minute. And then they go inside, bring a file, that ubiquitous plastic bag into which everybody in India carries all their priceless documents. They would bring it out, lay it out. And some of these are as old as 1936, going, pre-independence, because they are land papers. They've been sometimes written by British. These are because they are holding these so preciously at home, because they determine whether they'll be declared Indian or foreigner. So the same thing happened with Shah Jahan's family. And it was only after that, they had all the papers, passport, some of them, they had their school papers, and they had their college certificates, marriage certificates, and all of that. And still they were declared, some of them were declared foreigners. I actually started reporting in Assam when I went to cover, sort of actually daily stories for a few weeks during the first draft of the NRC in 2018. In August 2019, that was when the final draft was supposed to come. And in that interim is when I reported most in Assam. That is, some of these pictures are really to get a sense of the place for people who have not been there. This is one of the Foreigners Tribunals. This is in Kamrup, Assam. And, Abhishek also showed some pictures, but, not all buildings are complete. Not all buildings are even there. Foreigners Tribunals are just makeshift. There are 100 of them in Assam now, and they are just makeshift centers sometimes. So I'd like to say, what are the reasons why somebody is declared a foreigner in a Foreigners Tribunal? I'll get to, what I really found out. But in this chaos of finding out how, as they said, it's an opaque system, it really is hard to prove it. And Abhishek talked about realizing and thinking about his grandmother. And although I'm not from Assam or Bengal or the Northeast, I also came back home thinking about how I would prove it if someone asked me whether I'm Indian. I would have to go back and ask my grandfather his papers, and my paternal side grandfather, and my father's father he passed away a very long time ago. Even before my dad was born, actually, I have only my maternal grandfather, and I would ask him about his papers. I would ask everyone else, and I tried to draw a lineage, because the process here, as others have said, is you can determine your citizenship only by tracing your ancestry to one old citizen in your family, the ancestor. It can be your grandmother or your grandfather from anywhere, but given conventions, there is another problem that there are laws, and then there are conventions, and there is the bureaucracy and what they accept and what they don't. Often they don't accept women's papers. So here is a family who they had for a moment thought that they lost a document which links all of them. And there was utter panic. And they just started, these are all brothers, and they were just hunting for it. Because if you have lost a document, you can be declared a foreigner. If you have never gone to school as a woman, and the first time you appeared on any document was when you voted as a wife of somebody in a different village in which you were not born, you can be declared a foreigner. If you were displaced several times in a flood or any other disaster, which happens a lot in Assam, Bengal, in that part of any of them who live around the Brahmaputra, it happens regularly. This is a relief eligibility certificate. Someone is held on to it through all the floods that they have waded through. Because this is a way for them to prove that I didn't suddenly turn up in a new village because I am from Bangladesh. I suddenly turned up in a new village because that is where I could find space after my village was washed away. There are all kinds of people who can be determined foreigners. There are people who were in the Navy, in the armed forces. They also are declared foreigners. There are people who are academics, journalists. Their families have been declared foreigners. People whose neighbors didn't like them and had a fight would file a complaint against them for, as them being a suspected foreigner to the local border police. Then they could be declared foreigner, because once you're suspected, you have to go through the whole process. That's all. Children who don't have any documents because they are too young, they can be declared foreigners. Entire villages or entire families, because they are linked to one person who has somehow given wrong documents or just couldn't understand this entire chaotic system, has been declared foreigners. So an entire joint family or an entire relatives, all of them can be declared foreigner. I actually went in that picture in the right corner top. I went to meet one woman in the orange sari, and every other person in the next half an hour turned up to say, the reasons why they were a foreigner. So this importance of this document made me also realize another thing, that some people have, as all of them explained, some people have been going through a process before the NRC, that is the Foreigners Tribunal. This is, so if you are already declared a foreigner or going through a process in the Foreigners Tribunal, even then the NRC will say that you are not, you can be excluded from the NRC. So here is this weird situation where if you are declared a foreigner, then you can't be in the NRC. And if you're not in the NRC, you will have to go into the Foreigners Tribunal. It is an endless cycle. And that endless cycle that Abhishek said, that his editor asked him to draw a chart. I did draw a chart, given that I was not from Assam and didn't really see it every day. I bugged all of them, got this information and drew a chart for myself. And as he said, everything leads to detention center. Everything ends up in the Foreigners Tribunal. Whatever you do, you cycle back into some way in which you get into the detention center. These are some of the pictures I took inside Foreigners Tribunals. I want to show it because for me also it was, you'd think that somebody's citizenship would be declared, is a precious thing. First of all, we don't think about it at all. It is something that we don't know is precious to us, that we don't know is ours for most people. But for people thinking about it every day, this is the kind of system that they're going into. And for me, the buildings represented a space that, both was intimidating to them, but also absolutely labyrinthian. They could not, there are no boards. There is really nobody to help you. You just sit there. People are sitting under staircases, going with their most life's precious documents, going inside, being asked questions, sometimes in a language that they don't understand. Even if they are spoken to in Assamese or Bengali, sometimes it is usually Assamese. They have to look at documents which are in English. And lawyers are translating this world for them. This is also, you can see a white thing at the back. This is also a Foreigners Tribunal, which is inside, behind a gym. This is also a Foreigners Tribunal on the first floor. And this is a kind of judgment that you get when you actually get after the end of the trial in the Foreigners Tribunal. So I felt, as I said earlier, nobody really believed the victims. So I wanted to find empirically some details about whether there is a pattern of bias or whether people are just crying holy murder for nothing at all, that the state was absolutely right in picking out illegal immigrants. And these were just people who wanted to be Indians because, they got great income of 700 rupees a day and they wanted to live here and not in Bangladesh. And they've all come here because this is where they want to be. Suppose they're all lying, all of them. Is this true or not? So I asked for data from the all 100 Foreigners Tribunals to give me the judgments from between July to December 2018. I just picked 6 months. It was, I filed all of this in January. So I picked July to December and asked them to give me all the paperwork, all the judgments that were passed by those Foreigners Tribunals. Only 5 replied, although all of them are supposed to have public information officers and come under the RTI Act. Only 5 replied. At least 30 of them just gave some excuse or the other and said that they are exempt from giving the information. This was wrong. So the 5 that did give simply, just gave it as a matter of routine. It was just somebody who was good at his job. So but still, just those 5 tribunals meant 515 judgments. So when I analyzed them, there were some things that this is example of how it can be, how it can look. It's in a narrative form. So I have to populate from this what actually happens. So after 515 tribunal orders that I analyzed, I found that whatever case comes in front of them, 82% of these were declared foreigners. And 89% of the cases that came in front of them involved Muslims. 9 of 10 Muslims, that is 90% of Muslims whose cases came in front of the Foreigners Tribunal would be declared foreigners. 40% of Hindus whose cases came in front of them would be declared foreigners. And almost 80% of these cases of people were declared foreigners without even being heard. This is called an ex parte order. This means that that person didn't even turn up for their trial because of many reasons, I won't go into them now, often not their fault. And they were still declared foreigners. And then, they are sitting at home, the police comes and arrests them. When often the border police says they were absconding, but when they have to detain them, they find them quite easily. Many people who I found were accused twice. That means you have a case going on, you've already been declared an Indian. Actually, you're not declared an Indian. You're accused of being a foreigner. So you're either declared a foreigner or a not foreigner. You're not a foreigner. So then they say they can be accused again that you're not Indian. This woman that I met in Borpeta was actually, she thought that she was done with her case. But when I met her, I went with a copy of the judgment that I was given by the Foreigners Tribunal, and the dates on the 2 judgments were completely different. The one that she had and the one that I had. That means that she had already been declared foreigner, not Indian. And she was thinking whether she should file another case in the court, in the High Court to appeal. But I have here come with another document, which she didn't know existed. And it was heartbreaking for me. Forget heartbreaking. It was just horrifying for everybody involved to find somebody come in with another case that says that they're not an Indian. That's how she discovered it. There are, lots of, so these were the patterns of bias, which I found, which made me realize that it's riddled with errors. If, for example, if somebody's name is spelled wrong in one document and another document, they say that these are not 2 same people. So if my grandfather's name, I'm going to use my actual grandfather's name. So if my grandfather's name is Krishnan, and my mother's document, which is what I'm going to connect to, she has Parvati G in her name, and they'll say Krishnan and G are not the same, although she has other paperwork that says, that she is, her father is Krishnan. And so then, because my mom's documents are not believed, my documents are not believed because of this variation, which happens to all of us across the country. So it's riddled with errors, it's arbitrary, and it was inconsistent because some courts, some foreigners tribunals took certain papers, some others didn't take it. And what I have here is a list of names of people who are the Foreigners Tribunal members. We shouldn't call them judges because not all of them are retired or working. None of them are working judges. And those who did not declare enough foreigners were terminated. Their contracts were not renewed. So there was a system that did not allow people to have a fair chance to prove themselves, even though the system itself was complicated. None of them really had a chance to prove fairly that they were Indian or whatever they had and whatever understanding they could muster. This is a family of, this is a family that a lawyer pointed out to actually, and the man in the red t-shirt is Dilip Biswas, and those are his daughters, and the lady at the back on top is his wife. Dilip Biswas was detained in 2009. Suddenly they came to his house. This is his house. He's a farmer, and he was declared foreigner, and his wife and 2 children, this girl in the green salwar, she is 17 now. So when I met her in 2019, she was 17, and she and her, they were very young when they were detained, and all of them were put in detention camp for 9 years. And somebody who is his friend, who's a neighbor, appealed on his behalf, on Dilip Biswas' behalf, in the High Court many years later. And in February 2019, the High Court said that the Foreigners Tribunal had made an error and none of them should have been put in detention camp. And not only was Dilip Biswas wrongly declared a foreigner because the Foreigners Tribunal wrongly rejected a land revenue document that he submitted, the girls and his wife shouldn't have even been put because they are not, they are not really at all been accused of being a foreigner. So they shouldn't have ever been detained or put in the detention camp. And then they came out and they were trying to restart their lives as people who spent 9 years in a detention camp. But they were also constantly afraid that this could happen again. Kalpana, the girl who was 17, when I met her, she said that it felt like she didn't know how to talk to other girls. She just didn't know how to talk to other people. And she had not been allowed to go to school when she was in the detention camp. The other girl who was younger, she went for a few years to school. She was allowed primary school. And they felt like they were in a new world and that they had done a crime even before they had grown up. I'll stop here because, I'm sure there's questions. And I will especially want also Makepeace to add in some of the reporting that she did, because some of the details of the detention camp and what happens when you're actually going through this process, they have reported in much more detail. For me, this was a moment of, this personal thing. I went there as an objective, whatever. I don't believe in this objective thing. I'm going there as a person who's never thought about her citizenship to a place where people constantly think about it. So already I'm not objective. But you come back thinking of belonging, of what migration means, of all the things that they all mentioned before. So, who's indigenous, who's an outsider. Every one of us has an outsider. I, as a Tamil speaking person living in Bangalore, is an outsider. And as I saw, the effect of these processes in Assam, even though the NRC just stalled and nothing happened after that, people are waiting who have been declared foreigner and who have been excluded from the NRC are waiting for the next step. Then, of course, the COVID happened, everything has been stalled. But so far away in Bangalore, there are slums, places where people are working who are suddenly declared Bangladeshi and their slums are demolished, they are detained, they are arrested, and then after some days again let out. There is a constant cycle of this outsider narrative that has entered our daily lives in the rest of the country as well. So this is not something that is happening only in one corner of our country, but it does affect everybody around.
Right. Thank you so much, Rohini, for sharing that. I think the only thing I can imagine contributing to what you guys have already very neatly and thoroughly covered in your presentation, and really kudos for that, because I think it was very little time given for that. But the thing about detention center, I think a lot of people might think that it's like, proper detention center, which is dedicatedly for, people who've been declared foreigners or basically illegal foreigners, or people who are flouting their Passport Act and all that. This is just to kind of, this is again another revelation for anyone, whether who was, sort of reporting being based in Assam or, coming from outside, was that, these are just really, they're just being detained in prison. There is no, there is one detention camp in Martia, which is, coming up and everything. And it's been really sort of propped up as like, the model detention center. As if there should be a model detention center if at all. But, apart from that, really what for the last almost 14 years, I think that's when detention centers started getting activated. If I'm not wrong, correct me, Saha, that around 2008 or 9, that's when people started, being sent to detention camps. And these are essentially it's just a dedicated, I don't even think you can call it a dedicated cell, because they say that it's a dedicated cell within, the district prisons or the state prisons and all of that. But I've spoken to enough people who've said that, a lot of the detainees are mixed with just, with criminals, with hard convicts, in fact, whether they're, for that matter, people who accused them of murder or rape or like huge robbery. Very, very quick example I can sort of just cite from, an investigation that will soon be published in the coming months of mine. I mean, this is someone who has been, I looked at the case of, someone who has basically completely, thoroughly exhausted all all the legal avenues that he can go to after he was being declared a foreigner. So he was declared a foreigner. He tried making an appeal to the High Court. It did not work. He tried making an appeal to the Supreme Court, and he's just exhausted all legal measures, any kind of sort of avenue that could perhaps rescue him from this entire sort of a system. But he has, of course, done his 2-3 years in the detention camp, but this is what, the story is largely looking at, and with some data, of course, to back it up, and looking at his life. What is the life? What exactly does it mean for someone who is a stateless person, who is a declared foreigner, and for whom there is no one coming to any rescue, right? But one of the things that really struck me hard was, when he talked about like his time in the detention center, he talked about how there was also this kind of profiling of him being a foreigner, where people, even the people in the prison, even the people in the so-called detention camp or the prison, were judging him hard, based on that. He was profiled for for coming in as someone as someone who's a declared foreigner, so there was also that kind of social isolation within the prison system, because he was a so-called Bideshi, and it was really interesting because what he said was the only person who spoke to him was was a rapist. I mean, those are exactly his words, that the only person who kind of befriended him was someone who's accused of rape. And I just find that, the irony of it, or, just I don't know, like the sort of, it's a very dark kind of, it's a very dark side of sort of, this entire quagmire of citizenship regime that I at least see it as, where, you find friendships in really, really the oddest places and among the most unlikely of allies. But I have a few questions that I just want to very quickly sort of, ask of both Abhishek and Rohini. If I can start with Abhishek, actually, you've spoken about in your book, as well as out here, that, as someone who grew up here, you are Bengali, but you're also someone who grew up in the Guwahati, right? At the same time, you're coming in and you're working, you were at that time reporting for the Indian Express, so I'm just wondering, how difficult was it for you to be really, quote unquote, impartial, as journalist reporters are expected to be when you're reporting this, whether you're reporting the NRC or you were reporting the Foreigners Tribunals, and especially when you were reporting the, the protests that were really sort of like really big, against the Citizenship Amendment Act in Assam, or for that matter, even there were, some hate crimes that had happened. I think that I remember you had gone and done some stories around in Meghalaya, these hate crimes were again perpetuated against, people from an identity that you belong to, so how difficult was it to report on these, these cases where the very identity which is being villainized as the intruder is the one that you come from?
Thanks, Makepeace, for the question. Really interesting. Yeah, you are right. There are this thing that you belong to an identity. While I was reporting in Kashmir, I was covering much more gruesome incidents of violence, state excesses, but my identity was never on the line. But what happened in Assam is that I figured out that people who share my identity, or the identity which I come from, my family's linguistic identity, being a Bengali in Assam, there are Bengali families, Bengali Hindu families, who are really, they're really suffering from the state's citizenship determination mechanisms. And also, as you said, that during the anti-C, because such is the politics around the CAA in Assam, that it's assumed that the state's Bengali-speaking Hindu population will be an obvious supporter of the act, because it basically connects. It basically is promised as a cure for NRC exclusion of Bengalis, and doing right the wrongs that the Bengalis in Assam and other parts of Northeast India suffered during during the partition. And obviously, my situation was it's very difficult to explain this because so my grandparents on both sides were partition refugees, and my grandmother, who I said is presently finds herself out of the NRC, is a refugee. She came in as a 8-year-old child in 1949, 48, 49, and now the thing is that she is basically the classic case study for whom the BJP promises the CAA, that she lives in Assam, she's out of the NRC, and she should be included in the NRC because there is a CAA. She should not be a foreigner because there is the CAA. But the counter argument to this thing is, which I found out basically, is that, say for example, my grandmother was, her name, I have found her name in along with our other relatives, like her brothers, 3 brothers, in the 1951 NRC. Then she also appears in the 1965 voters list as a 24-year-old voter. And then absurdly, she's marked a doubtful voter in 1997. And of course, these stories are not only limited to my grandmothers, there are hundreds of such cases. So the thing is, the counter argument is that if only the processes, the mechanisms of the state, if only the mechanisms of the state were fair, were not biased, were not, the argument which I say in my book is, after analyzing scores of case studies, is that it appears that the state's mechanisms in Assam, the various arms of the state, it could be the border police, which is investigating. There are so many instances which all of us have covered, where the border police, the person that the border police has picked up is how the border police has made that decision to investigate that particular person, no one knows. Why that particular person was picked up, no one knows. Similarly, the Foreigners Tribunal. Similarly, so many earlier, now there have been so much criticism of detention centers that the current regime has brought, as if the current regime has brought in the detention centers. But no, detention centers, as you said, 2008, 2009, its genesis lies in a Guwahati High Court order, where the Guwahati High Court said that people declared to be foreigners should be enclosed in a space and they shouldn't be let out. So different arms of the state have been very proactive in these mechanisms, and these mechanisms, as Rohini's investigations, your investigations, and some of the case studies in No Lands People, all these case studies, what they show essentially is that there is a great degree of arbitrariness in the hands of the state, which the state has done in the name of its, in the disguise of its foreigner detection processes. So coming back to that thing about the CAA, my argument remains that for a person, and not only my grandmother, there are like so many Bengali Hindu case studies that I know of, who would have been very easily citizens of India, and pass these citizenship determination processes with the papers they hold, had there not been arbitrariness, had there not been bias, had things been fairer, So that's the thing. Now, it's a very difficult position to explain that even without the CAA, many Bengalis in Assam would have found their way correctly through the NRC mechanism, would not have had to suffer through the citizenship determination mechanisms, had only the bureaucratic administrative mechanisms been fairer, And coming back to your larger question about my identity coming or not in the line of my reportage, on retrospection, I think that, yes, there were difficult moments. I mean, there were difficult moments when you are reporting and you are realizing that I had reported a story over phone, not going to, no, I had not gone to Shillong at that time. I had reported it over phone from Guwahati, which said that that certain organizations in Meghalaya had put up banners in Shillong saying that all Bengalis are Bangladeshis, and Shillong has a large Bengali population, many of whom are a large percentage of whom are actually probably victims of partition, migrants at that point of time or later. Now, on reporting on such issues, yes, there have been instances when it has struck me that I'm basically reporting a story in which people belonging to my identity are on the line of fire. But yeah, I guess that's a part of the job. I mean, you do that, and regarding partiality or impartiality, I think that's I think your training as a journalist, as a reporter, makes you that kind of very much like a, I don't know what to say, but it's like a doctor treating a critical patient, and the patient might die or something bad might happen, but the doctor probably maintains a very clinical kind of emotional relation with that.
I suppose that's the only way to kind of do the job dispassionately, right? And also yet, most importantly, very accurately. Rohini, I have this, I've always actually thought of asking you this because I've read your book as well, Seasons of Trouble. And in fact, just the narration that I had just mentioned about the character that from my current story, there was a very similar sort of a scenario that played out. If I remember, I don't remember the name of the character because I'm bad with names, but where one of the guys who's basically been who'd been kidnapped, for the lack of a better word, who had been unlawfully detained, and he was thrown into prison and everything. Again, in when he was caught in that whole scenario and everything, when he was talking to other prisoners, and correct me if I'm wrong with my memory on this, that he was very easily sort of picked out and identified as Elam Tamil, right? Especially his Sinhalese accent. He was speaking in Sinhalese, but even despite that, his accent really sort of gave him away. I was wondering how similar and or for that matter even different was it covering the citizenship exercise in Assam that way?
You mean for the people that I was interviewing, or for?
From the people you were interviewing when you spoke to them about when you spoke to them about how they were questioned and interrogated in the tribunals, or for that matter, if and when they were questioned or inquired upon by the border police officials.
So the strange comfort that some people would have near the courts is that everyone around them is just is accused of being a foreigner. So they can assume that otherwise people in general, I think any of us who are not every day going to court, who are not lawyers or people who work in a court sort of scenario, would feel very, our body language would be very nervous in a space like that, right? So most people enter like that, and then in the say the chai shop nearby or the other places, they would hang out or smoke, and then they would start really feeling that there are so many people like me. Even as I was interviewing people on, for example, how did the border police file the notice that you have to go to court? If I asked just this simple question, they could only answer that by calling all their neighbors. Everyone around them sort of knew that this person was trying to find whether there was a notice that was served on them. And somebody, say the village chief, may have seen the notice being served on a pole somewhere or the market, and then all of them go. So there is a strange sort of belonging with all the accused. And at the same time, there is this shame and isolation that people feel because they are still not belonging. Your entire family is in doubt, but they feel like they are just not able to prove with papers what they so deeply believe. It's like someone asking a person who has delivered a baby, is that your baby? It has come out of her, right? So she knows that has happened, but someone says, prove it to me. Without a DNA test. So, it is an extremely, so they felt like they were belonging, but also absolutely isolated. And the similarity in, anyway, people's victims of a collectively meted out injustice, always I have found in any other story that I've covered, say that my story is not mine alone. There are many people who are like me. I'm not special. My story is not unique. And then they go on to tell you the most harrowing story. This is how everyone begins. So they feel part of a larger collective of people who've been unjustly dealt with, and also are in a strange position of not being able to help each other out as well.
Actually, what I meant to ask you was because in many ways, I'm not drawing a very direct parallel between, of course, what happened with the Tamils in Sri Lanka and what's been happening with, let's say, the largely Bengali ethnic linguistic identity in Assam. But, because in this particular scenario, I remember from the book, which really kind of, which I really stayed with me, was because this guy wasn't really part of like the separatist movement. He was just a regular guy who was kind of caught in this whole dragnet, So that's what I was sort of trying to ask you, like, what were the kind of parallels you felt? Did you feel like, because you obviously have had, several years of experience, writing, experience reporting, both for the book as well as many stories that you've done in the post-civil war in Sri Lanka. So like, what are the kind of, similar identity battles and, this kind of, sort of struggle to prove your kind of, loyalty to a certain nationality or nationhood that you saw also similarly?
Yeah, I think people who are trying to prove who they are, there's a strange way in which you have to describe who you are without really knowing what are the pointers the other person is looking for, right? So you are trying to take out papers because that's what they've asked you, but you feel you're already part of this. I am different. I speak a different language. Say I'm talking about a Bengali person. I speak a different language. Many of them can speak Assamese, especially if they are not, really old or not children. They can really speak. Especially men can. And yet, they are, or they dress in a quite similar way. They could. Some don't. Some could. And still, they felt that they had to prove that they belong. I saw this most, of course, around the CAA, around elections, around when the CAA was announced, and especially among Bengali Hindus, because they felt that there was now an opportunity in which, if I prove it, as Abhishek was also saying, it is so easy to prove it. I have no doubt, and I am also not going to face a biased state, is what they assume. And then this will be fine, it will be solved. So around the time of the elections in Assam, I found a growing a gap between the victims who were Muslim and victims who were Hindus, who were both Bengali, because one had an opportunity, supposedly, to prove themselves. And of course, they would then go on to realize that that opportunity was really badly defined and it really didn't exist. But they assumed at that point during the election, which was useful for the BJP, which was offering the CAA. And I remember one woman telling me, she was a Bengali Hindu, and I mean, I can't remember her name, but I remember her sitting just near her field. It was all green behind her. She was in a red sari with red vermilion. She was as Hindu Bengali as they could come, right? And she in a picture, and she pointed to her neighbor, who was in every way the stereotypical Bangladeshi Muslim. He had a beard. He was an old man. He was wearing a lungi. He was, he was in every way who people are fearing is the Bangladeshi immigrant. She said that he is a friend of my father. We are both. I have no doubt that he's a citizen. But it is only I who have a chance. I know that by voting for the BJP, I am going to throw him in the well. This was her exact words, that I'm going to throw him in the well. But I have to save my family. So I am going to, because I will get the CAA then. That will benefit me. So this gap grew, and people who are already isolated are trying to grapple with, they're not going to feel solidarity or anything when they're trying to just save their own lives.
Thank you, Makepeace, Abhishek, and Rohini for this really, what I would say, like a rich description, it's a thick description of actually what is happening currently. And all of you are journalists who have covered this, but the way I look at all the three of you, you're also covering it from different, multiple lenses and bringing perhaps consciously or subconsciously your own personal histories and ways of looking at the world. And I do think that is our task. I would encourage everyone, we have about 5-10 minutes more. We have run over time, but we do have time for questions. Before I move on to just reading out the audience questions, there are a couple of things, actually listening to all of you, I'd like to kind of pick up on just comments. They're not questions. I mean, one is this something I think Abhishek had mentioned, right? The fact that people who were in the detention centers, and that's a much longer process. It's not just those are not in the NRC. There are no detention centers technically. There are people who are in jails in 6 different centers in Assam, right? And women are kept in the Kokrajhar jail, and there are others from different parts. And after Supreme Court ruling, also post the COVID pandemic, if you spent 2 years in jail, you can apply for bail. But I think we are at a point historically in this country, and this is not just, I suppose, in Assam, bail, which is kind of a fundamental right. We celebrate it. When somebody gets bail, we think it's the greatest victory that's happened. And I think something for all of us to pay our attention to is the fact that those who've come out of these detention centers, at least in my experience, people I've spoken to and filmed with, they do come from extremely poor families. That's number one. Each of them actually have to go. It's not that you're out of jail and your case is going to go on. Of course, it's another matter. There's the whole circuit of citizenship that we've all managed to produce with lawyers, and there's an industry that's come out, right? People making money out of really poor people. That you have to go to the local police station every week. You have to go present yourself once you're out on bail. And it's not that you go to a local police station, which is 5 minutes away. I mean, it's the police station in your ilaka. So it could be 20 minutes by walk, or it could be a 1-hour bus ride. And every week you have to actually go. And what I'm actually trying to draw attention to is that there is a material cost to this, which is money and time. There is also a psychological cost to this, because in my conversation, again, when I was speaking to some people in January earlier this year, it is also what it leaves you with, right? People and women, of course, there's no empirical data for this, but this is just some kind of ethnography I did, that what it does to your body, that for 2 years and 3 years, you're in the jail, you don't have nutrition of a certain kind. Actually, for prisoners, there's a manual. I mean, there is supposed to be a detention center manual, but nobody knows what it is. You're not allowed to work. What it actually leaves you with once it comes out. And I think that's something perhaps we need to pay a little bit more of attention to. And the second thing about this detention center that's actually coming up in, I mean, I've been consistently going there since 2018, when it was just land. And now every time I go over the past, 4 years, they say it's going to finish. So the last time I visited it was in January 2022, which is an almost 85% finished structure. It's I think portending to a certain form of carceral state. States, it's not like it wasn't the case before, but actually what is this movement doing? And if you go to the detention center, and it's actually the project that it actually represents should be shocking and horrifying all of us, right? So when you enter, of course, it visually represents perhaps other camps in history that we may have actually seen. So I'm very curious about who was the architect who decided the entrance should be the way it does. But there is a school, there is a hospital, and there's a school for children actually. And the school for children is right next to a watchtower. There is a recreational ground. There is a big open kitchen, and of course the women are segregated. There's a courtyard for women where they can come in. So what I'm also drawing our attention to is the architecture of the detention center, which we must be paying closer attention to, because there is a certain form of carceral state that the project has started. And not just that, I mean, I'm told that there are 4 other states in which such detention centers are going to come, because the Assam detention center is going to be the model detention center, and which we must all be emulating. So I just thought I'd just share these two comments before we go to the questions. Amrita Datta asks, and I guess any of you could answer this, Rohini, Abhishek, or Makepeace. Hi guys, how would you assess the Supreme Court's role in failing to make the NRC process less arbitrary? Or were these structural biases that you all speak of product of Assam's politics? I'm not going to answer that, even though I have very strong opinions on this, but I will let one of you answer this. Who wants to take it, or should I just?
I think Abhishek should take the lead on
Abhishek.
But I can contribute, but I think Abhishek should probably take the lead on this.
Hi. I think this is a very pertinent question and a very difficult question to answer as well, because I have actually heard opinions from lawyers who are quite adept at citizenship processes, that the Supreme Court being there had actually made the NRC per se, had the Supreme Court not, I have been told that had the Supreme Court not been there, there were so many other things in which the NRC could have been much more arbitrary. That's one perspective. But then there are several other perspectives. There are several other issues, much of which is discussed in detail in Nolan's People, is that, for example, the issue of Gaon Panchayat certificate for women, the Supreme Court had said that there is a long legal history about the acceptance of that particular document, which is the Gaon Panchayat certificate, Gram Panchayat certificate, which is especially used by women. Women in cases which, as Rohini was discussing, where women do not have any other documents. They haven't been to school. They don't hold land. So what do you do to prove that you belong to this village and you are born to these two people, your parents? So you get it written by the village headman. Now, there is a long legal history vis-a-vis the Gram GP certificate. It's called the GP certificate. GP certificate, the acceptance of GP certificate in the NRC process. And the case went to Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that, if that it will be accepted, but after scrutiny, after proper scrutiny. And when the court mentioned that scrutiny thing, it opened up, it gave a great leeway. That scrutiny thing, apparently, according to lawyers, I cite some lawyers in my book, and some case studies, and it basically, there are many women, thousands of women, whose Gram Panchayat certificate was not accepted in the NRC. And there are lawyers and activists who hold that Supreme Court verdict to be responsible for this thing. Then there are other issues. For example, the most important issue, like, even as I keep going back to the NRC and this question of arbitrariness in the NRC, whether NRC was arbitrary or not, probably the biggest contention that remains in this thing, and I may be wrong in this, and the others on this panel could have better opinions, but I think one of the most important thing to note here is this category called the original inhabitants. So basically, there was this category called OI, and it's not the bureau. It's not the brainchild of the bureaucrat who led the NRC, or it's not the brainchild of the government, of the ruling Congress, the then Congress government, or the now BJP government. No, it's there in the citizenship rules, and it was just implemented in a certain way that there could be OIs in Assam whose document need not be scrutinized. They can be included in the NRC with much less scrutiny of their documents vis-a-vis others whose documents would be scrutinized in a much more stringent manner. And who benefited from this? It's essentially that if there aren't the investigations on this thing, there hasn't been much written on OI categories. I fished out some government documents which are there in the book. spoke to some officials, read newspaper reports during 2016, 15, 16, 17, which basically dealt with how OI was, basically being carried out on the ground. And the thing which I finally concluded is that it basically worked on the basis of surnames. If your surnames is caste Hindu Assamese or one of the many ethnic communities in Assam, you would be in the NRC. Yeah, you would be in the NRC without even say one of your link documents is a weak document, Now the counter argument remains that there are case studies of Assamese Hindus being excluded from the NRC, but that's kind of an error that happened, but it's not structure. If we talk about the NRC structure, it had an OI category, which made it, in my opinion, if you want to question whether the NRC, if you want to answer this question, whether or not the NRC was arbitrary, the only thing, the biggest pivot here in this is the OI category, because what it essentially happened is, if someone has a Saha surname or someone has an Ali Hussain surname, your papers will be scrutinized. Your papers will be scrutinized to the hilt. You are made to understand that this mega exercise is essentially in place to scrutinize your citizenship, not to scrutinize the citizenship of a Bhattacharya, Saikia, Goswami, Bhattakur. I'm sorry, I'm taking surnames, but that's the best way to explain to a larger audience. Thanks.
Thanks, Abhishek. Makepeace, would you like to add?
No, I think just he mentioned OI, and I think that's what was also really screaming loud in my head. But I think Gautam Bharti has written very well on this in his blog. I think especially the exchange of the sealed envelopes between the NRC coordinator and the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time. I think that lack of transparency in many of these judgments does make, I think, the handling, because I remember the question was about if the Supreme Court's handling of the NRC or management of the NRC was arbitrary. I think that part especially sort of drives home the point. That's just the only thing I wanted to add.
I'll add a quick thing that in connection to Subasri, what you said of the detention camps, one thing that I could not write about, many of us could not write about, was because the Chief Justice of India, then Ranjan Gogoi, was from Assam. And he definitely had, we're all so worried about our objectivity in doing our job as journalists, but he was not at all worried, and we couldn't mention it. And in fact, he was very zealous about certain things. And I just want to quote one thing that he said in March 2019. At that time, the data was that there were 1.17 lakh declared foreigners since the 80s. But in the detention camps, there were only 900 people, right? So his quote in March 2019 was this: the existing detention centers are housing 900 people as against the so many who have been declared foreigners. Why are there not thousands in the detention camps? He asked this. And in the next months, there were mass detentions. And I remember reporting there then, and everybody started to say that police was coming to detain them. Even when their cases were going on, one case is going on, one case is declared foreigner, and more numbers of people were thrown in detention camp. So this is also a role that the Supreme Court, and especially the Chief Justice at the time, played in making the state, which actually sometimes did not act as fast as the government wanted or the CJI wanted. He was pushing them to incarcerate more people.
Thank you all for your responses. We'll take the last comment and question from Rupali Samuel, who herself is based in Guwahati and was actually one of the panelists in the first session, Citizenship and its discontent. So thank you, Rupali, for being here and asking. So her comment is, thank you so much for a great set of interventions. I completely agree with Abhishek. The law and judges at all levels are equally implicated in the larger political project of exclusion described as detection and deportation. Makepeace, it's really eye-opening to hear your unraveling of the category of indigenous as it's deployed in Assam. The question is, how do we engage more honestly with questions of identity and history where the law and these legal institutions have crystallized a version of these claims that is now so hegemonic. Would any of you like to take a shot at it? And I can close and then we'll hand it over to SSAF. I mean, I'm happy to take this if nobody else wants to, because, or if one of you can just.
I've already sort of, I mean, at least from my bit, I said that kind of towards the conclusion of my presentation or whatever, right at the beginning, that, you know, I think that's the reason, one of the reasons why I sort of also adopted that lens, as you rightly said, because this entire citizenship, or whether you look at it from citizenship regime or you look at it as a foreigner issue, it has so many facets. It has, I mean, literally it's a several heads monster. So, you know, what I found actually merited like that kind of investigation, or a very deep kind of a deep in-depth look, was also to sort of really look into the claims of the so-called persecutor, or at least the dominant community, which has been really at the helm of, when I'm saying at the helm, I mean not just the helm of the state affairs, or whether we're talking about like, you know, the former CGI and all of that, but also at the helm of leading agitations in the past, leading more recent protests, and, you know, really sort of also investigating, you know, their, I would say, social locations, right? I mean, so that includes, even for that matter, not just their caste, but also their origins, you know, because there is such a, I mean, there is such a, you know, sort of, as you said, like it's a very hegemonic sort of a thing. It is accepted at face value, almost as if there isn't really any room. Like it is the most sort of biblical truth out there. And I didn't quite like, I guess because I came from the region, it's something that always was a bit puzzling to me. I never really quite bought the whole thing as well, you know, the way it was at least presented or sold to me. So I think that needs, some of that narrative needs also, not for the sake of you know, sort of demonizing the other. I mean, that's not really what my, at least that's not the intention of the background that I come from, where I feel the necessity to demonize, you know, the persecutor or something like that, but really to kind of also place them in their history, you know, because I think many of these, if you can call them insecurities, and these actions that stem from these deep-seated insecurities also has its own, you know, has its own reasons, has its own background and you know, story to it. And that's what perhaps has interested me the most. And I've, you know, kind of tried to do as much in my work, apart from just looking at what, like I remember Rohini said, just the victim, you know, because apparently the victim will, like, you know, a thief will always say, I never stole it, right? So, I mean, it really had, I think that also is a very good point to make, because I mean, I did turn the focus on, you know, sort of the people making all the claims or driving all the sort of, you know, the, if you can call it an agenda, or like the narrative around, you know, the illegal foreigners. So I think that helps, but it helps to really clear a lot of things.
Right. Sorry, we're really running out of time, so we have to close. But I mean, I just want to quickly respond to your question, Rupali, and actually thank you for answering it. And there's no one answer to this, because we are in what we call this construct of a nation state, which is a fairly new idea. We do have documents to prove we are who we say we are. And depending on your class, Subasri Krishnan will have 5 different kinds of documents to say who she is. But I think something that we perhaps could also start thinking about is the question of citizenship, or the figure of the citizen, not just in India, I'm saying historically in the 20th century and 21st century for sure, is entirely through the lens of evidence, and that is legal evidence, right? So you have your passport, you have your Aadhaar, you have your voter's ID, and perhaps this is a moment for all of us to start thinking of the figure of the citizen through the idea of presence and belonging. And I think people have been doing this, and I see great hope in this. Just to give an example in terms of in Assam itself, for instance, 2016 onwards, the rise of the Mia poetry is one way of actually making that claim to the idea of citizenship, which is not entirely just defined by what your legal status and category is, or whether that's stories, or whether that's certain kinds of oral history and testimony. So, and I think this is where I feel like the films and art begin to play a role. I think nonfiction films, not just in Assam, but in other places have been doing this, is to say that a legal category is not the only way that we need to look at the idea of personhood or citizen. And perhaps another way of thinking about this question could be the idea of presence and belonging. I mean, it may seem like a somewhat utopic idea now, but maybe 500 years from now, it may not be so. It may not be so. But yes, Abhishek, you want to say something?
Just to add briefly to what Makepeace and you said in response to Rupali's question, I think along with everything that you mentioned, including poetry and including perspectives, narratives in journalism, etc. But I genuinely feel, I mean, Rupali is herself a lawyer and activist in this thing. And I genuinely feel that what we, and I'm saying this being a journalist and being having reported on this thing, is that alongside other kinds of engaging honestly with questions of identity and history, I think we also really need very strong, I think people who are suffering this citizenship crisis or issues with the city also really need strong legal representation. I mean, this, if the persecution needs to be tackled, if the tag of the foreigner, if people have, if a person who is genuinely Indian need not be declared to be a foreigner and have her rights taken away, then she needs lawyers at the Foreigners Tribunals, lawyers who wouldn't be working on any ulterior motives of fleecing the person, which has also happened. There are middlemen lawyers who have done terrible things, but we also need great lawyers and great activists. I think that thing is also necessary.
Right. On that note, I will now hand it over to Gayatri from SSAF. Once again, Rohini, Makepeace, and Abhishek, thank you so much for sharing your work and helping us all know this better and pushing us to think about how does one think about these questions in the future. And over to you now, Gayatri.
Thanks, Subasri. By way of introduction, I'm Gayatri Uppal, Associate Director at SSAF. On behalf of SSAF, I would like to thank the panelists for agreeing to be part of this engaging discussion. Thank you, Subasri, for curating this series of conversations as part of your project, Facing History and Ourselves, and for today's discussion titled Trails of Partition. I would like to thank the panelists, Rohini Mohan, Abhishek Saha, Makepeace Sitlhou, for your enlightening presentations and a very engaging discussion. I thank the audience for joining us from different parts of the world and time zones and for their attention. I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce our colleagues at SSAF and thank them for their contribution to this event. Latika Gupta, Director Projects, for managing all aspects for this event. Saurav Sil is in charge of visual design, media and archives at SSAF and has designed the invitation and managed the technical aspects of the event. And Malvika Madgulkar, Assistant Editor, Publications and Communications, has handled the communications for this discussion. Santosh Sani is our Accounts Executive. Please do visit our website, ssaf.in, and follow us on social media for updates about forthcoming programs. Thank you all again for joining us today. Good night.